Okay, good morning. I want to begin by praying a collect from the prayers and thanksgivings, which can be found at the end of the prayer book. Let's turn to page 810. So this class has a couple of things going on, and I'll explain them. I'll enumerate them for you in a few minutes, but one of them is just to gain some facility with the book. That is, to just know what's in it. So if you go pick up a book that's been in the church for a while, you know, one of the dusty ones with kind of there are not very many of those. We tend to circle them out. No, like the red ones in a pew. We're very blessed to have many quite new copies of the prayer book in the actual pews of the church. But, you know, if you go around the building, you see some like this that are kind of raggedy. And if you just kind of flip open to a page, the spine is cracked at the prayers of the people. This is a perfect example, right? And if you want to find like another place where it kind of like naturally opens up to, it's Holy Eucharist right here. This is what we normally use the prayer book for, and this is all that most Episcopalians think is in the prayer book. And of course, there's a whole lot more in here. So one of the things we're going to be doing this semester is just trying to look at the other stuff that's in there. And to start, we have all of these beautiful prayers and thanksgivings for everything from the world, the church, the social order, the natural order. There's everything from a prayer for our courts, to a prayer for the conservation of natural resources, a prayer for social justice, a prayer for victims of addiction, a prayer for guidance, a prayer for quiet confidence, the prayer attributed to St. Francis, which we've been praying as part of the Sunday Eucharist, and so on. And then there are there's a whole separate section. There's 70 prayers total in that first section, and then there are 11 thanksgivings, prayers of thanksgivings. These include litanies, so like calls and responses. And some of them are really quite beautiful. You should check out sometime the prayers for the natural order and the prayers for family and personal life, just on your own time. Many of these prayers are incredibly beautiful. And we're going to be discussing, this is another thing we'll discuss this semester, is what does it mean to pray using words that were written for you? Okay, rather than extemporaneous prayer. What does it mean to pray using a written something or other? What does it mean to pray using a book? But just to start that conversation out, if you ever find yourself without words, you have kind of two options. One is to sit in the silence of not having words. And that's an incredibly beautiful thing. I would say not as a replacement to just sitting in your silence, in your wordlessness. You might also use words which are old, which have been written for you, which have been, it's kind of like using a piece of old silver that's been handed down for years and years and years. You know, it has that patina on it. Is that how you say that word, patina? These are prayers whose patina is quite developed. So you might try that. Just experiment with it. Just experiment using prayers that are found here in the back of the book. When you've got something you want to pray for, go look for it in the table of contents and then find the one here and just see what happens. But I want to start by praying the prayer for after worship. Regardless of whether or not you went to the 9:30 service, it's totally fine if you don't. But there are some themes that are introduced by this prayer that I want to discuss later on. So if we would pray it together. And this is on page 834. It's prayer 68 on 834. And you'll see that many of these prayers have italicized Rite One language. Rite One meaning the version of the liturgy that has these and thous in it, the traditional language liturgy. Many of these prayers were written using Rite One language. But they have the these and the thys and the thous in italics, and so you can replace them with contemporary language, just so that just so that it's easiest and we don't have to like work too hard in our brain, let's just stick with the these and the thys for right now. But this is just so that you know, if you're praying these on your own, they were, the authors of these prayers, the revisers of the 79 prayer book, intended for you to make a personal decision about whether or not you wanted to say, grant we beseech thee, Almighty God, or grant we beseech you, Almighty God. Okay? So that's, there you go. But let's stick with the these and the thys for right now. Let us pray together. Grant, we beseech thee, Almighty God, that the words which we have heard this day with our outward ears may, through thy grace, be so grafted inwardly in our hearts, that they may bring forth in us the fruit of good living, to the honor and praise of thy name, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, so we'll come back to this. There are just a couple of things that I want to do in this first session. One of which is to apologize right away for the fact that I do not yet have a syllabus for you. I've not made up a schedule of readings. I will get that out as soon as I can later this week. I do know what I'm going to ask you all to read for next week, so don't worry, I've got that. But in terms of like the overall arc of the class, I've not been able to prepare that yet. That'll be online on the on the regular God, Grace, and Gumption page. Okay, so that's under Go Deeper. The tab Go Deeper at the very top, Go Deeper, and then I think it's like weekday classes or something like that, classes, and then you find God, Grace, and Gumption under that, as well as Monday morning musings and that kind of thing. So both Jules and my classes will have our schedules on the website. The other thing is that we're streaming using a new method, okay? We're standardizing all of our streaming. We're no longer streaming in the regular place, you know, with the little YouTube box that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't, and it was hard to find the archives, you know. Where did last week's class go? And Father Justin's like, I have no idea, into the ether, I don't know. Now we've got it all worked out, and we'll all wave to the cameraman, thank you very much. The same people who are streaming our Sunday morning liturgy and our 9 o'clock adult forum are also streaming this class. So you can watch the classes live, or you can watch them after they've happened, all of them, by using the page that you use to stream the regular Sunday liturgies. And that's under the Connect tab of the website. There's also, I think it's on the banner, the scrolling banner that, you know, has all when you go to the home page and the banner shows you like the pastoral pup, everybody's like, ooh, pastoral pup, and they click that and they don't wait for anything else. Anyway, I think that there's a streaming one of those if you just wait for it. But you can find it using the Connect tab. Hopefully that'll solve most of our technological issues that we've had with the class in the past. That also means there will be a reliable archive of all the classes. So if you miss one, you can totally look at it. If you want to stay in your pajamas on Wednesday mornings and watch watch from bed, you're more than welcome to do that. I would like to. I suppose you could text me if you had a question, but that seems like a lot of work. So why don't you just come in person? But anyway, if you want to have breakfast in bed and watch, surely you can find something better to watch than God, Grace, and Gumption when you're in bed. But anyway, if you want to have breakfast in bed and watch, you can. Okay, I think that's enough I think that's all the logistical stuff I needed to say, except for a word of thanks for changing the time one more time for me. We switched from Wednesday mornings following the 9:30 service, which was the kind of traditional time for this class. It was the time when Bishop Grind taught this class and so on. We switched that because of my teaching schedule at Yale. Of course, I no longer have a teaching schedule at Yale because I'm full-time here, which I'm really excited about, which means we can move it back to Wednesday. Thanks. Thanks, that's very kind. You're very sweet. I saw my advisor last night, and I told her I was so incredibly happy, and she was very glad for me. So it was a very nice moment. Anyway, now that I don't have to go back and forth from New Haven during the day to teach, we can keep the class at its regular time. And I do think it is nice if it follows the 9:30 service, just for people who come to the 9:30. A reminder, just of the weekday schedule, which is new for St. Mark's. We haven't done this in a very long time. I think perhaps when Mother Vicki Davis was a priest here, that's the rumor I've heard, was the last time we had weekday worship regularly. But we do now, and this is part of our year-long, It's a kind of holy experiment that I personally hope gains some traction and might outlast our program year. But it's initiated by two things. One was our Spiritual Vitality Initiative, which led us to think that we needed to do two things. Primarily, we needed to learn more about spiritual practices that you could actually, take home and put into practice in your everyday life. And the second was to embed the Bible in everything that we do. And you'll see that reflected in just today's class. I hope you'll see that reflected in the syllabus. I think you should see both those things reflected in a lot of things that are going on here at the church. The second is our year-long focus on the way of love, which is the presiding bishops and the national church offices. Basically, they're repackaging the idea of a rule of life for the entire church. We'll be talking much more about what a rule of life is, its heritage. The most famous rule of life is, of course, St. Benedict's rule. And Anglicans have quite a long Benedictine heritage. Anglicanism, I like to think, is kind of Benedictinism for everyone. If you didn't think you were a monk or a nun, actually you're Anglican, so you kind of are. Anglicans are, it's kind of the monk and nun stuff for everyone. And we'll talk more about how the prayer book actually is an attempt to do that. A concrete attempt for our tradition to make that possible for lay people and for ordinary secular, quote-unquote, secular, meaning non-cloistered, non-monastic, and so on, secular parish clergy. Anyway, we'll talk about that when we discuss the Reformation history of the prayer book, the first Archbishop of Canterbury who drafted the first English prayer books, and so on. But this, the way of love is centered around these different spiritual elements. I'm not going to enumerate them all. You're going to be hearing about them at 9 o'clock. But this class on the prayer book has to do with two big ones, one of which is pray, and the other one is learn. Learn meaning to spend daily time with God, not only in prayer, but also in the Scriptures. And one of the ways to do that, actually, is by using the prayer book. And one of the ways to use the prayer book to do that is to pray morning prayer, to pray the daily office together corporately. And so we started to offer this on Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays in the chapel at 8:30. It's been really beautiful the first couple of days. We just started on Monday. I would commend that to you. You can also pray the office with us in bed, with your orange juice and your eggs or whatever as you're having breakfast. You can basically do all this stuff in bed. But if you would like to join us at 8:30, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, we would love that. That means there will be worship offered in the chapel once you add the Wednesday Eucharist, 6 days a week. Sabbath is currently Sabbath for our sacred spaces is currently Saturday, which I think is a really beautiful thing, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it potentially changes our life as a parish. Yes, Molly.
I wasn't able to be here for prayers for 9/11, and I wondered what prayers were offered here. Do you have them, and do you know what they were?
Sure. So what we did yesterday during morning prayer was at 8:46, all of the churches of the Episcopal Church in Connecticut, our diocese, were asked to toll their bells, which is the time when the first plane hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center. So we paused at 8:46 while the bells were tolled, and it just so happened we were right in the middle of the collect, which I had added to the service to commemorate those who had died in 9/11 and to pray for the world in its wake, which was a collect drafted by the former presiding bishop, these two presiding bishops ago, Frank Griswold. I'm happy to find you that prayer. It's a beautiful collect. It just so happened the bells tolled right in the middle of that collect. Yes?
So are the 8:30 services also on the video streaming thing? Because you
No.
said we could do it. So you're saying it's spirit.
Yes, that's right. And we'll discuss how exactly you can do that using a prayer book later on. I'll teach you, I'll show you the liturgy, I'll teach you how to say it on your own, and we can also talk about, I guess here's the thing. You're using a book that other people are praying with around the world. May not be using the exact words. I have some other countries' prayer books to show you. But using some similar words and some similar forms, so that even if you're by yourself, if you're using the book, you're kind of worshiping with other people. And I would say not just kind of worshiping with other people, I would say you are worshiping with other people. This is why it's the book of common prayer. And I want for us to think about this semester, what does it mean to be a people who pray in common? There are many different ways to be Christian. There are many different denominations and traditions, all of which are very beautiful. This is one of the things that makes us us. And there are lots of historical reasons for that, one of which is this kind of a mixture of, it's this kind of cocktail of Benedictine spirituality and Protestantism, which ends up being Anglicanism as Benedictinism for everyone, that I want us to think about long term. So maybe that's enough by way of like introduction to the spiritual themes of the course. This is one of the things I want to think about. What does it mean to be a people who pray in common? We've spoken a lot at St. Mark's about prayer practices in the contemplative vein. And the prayer book is just a different form of that. We haven't actually talked about how to pray with a prayer book very much. I think we kind of assume that everybody knows how to do it. And if you're like me anyway, it really takes some work to learn how to do it. So I want to teach you guys that. The other reason for this class now, not only is it kind of serendipitous in terms of like, you know, what we're working on as a parish, but it's also, the prayer book is in the news. Okay, so how many of you have heard that the Book of Common Prayer is currently in a process of being revised? Okay, good. So basically everyone. It is in the process of being revised. Now, what does that mean? Yeah, by years, we mean a very, very, very long time. And because of the decisions that were taken at General Convention around it, it will take even longer than a very long time. So here's what happened. This is way oversimplified. If you would like more information about the ins and the outs of the conversation, one of the things I'm going to build into the syllabus is some articles around what people are talking about prayer book revision. What are people interested in? Why do they think it needs to be revised? Why do some people think it doesn't need to be revised? And how all that kind of stuff works. We're going to look at that really post-October. But here's the nuts and bolts of the story as I understand it. 3 years ago, at our last, well, I guess it would have been 2 general conventions ago. You know, okay, so, sorry. I need to back up and just remember that, like, we got to explain everything, especially since we're broadcasting. Not everybody knows what General Convention is. Okay, so the Episcopal Church is organized using a legislative structure, okay, at the national level. This is kind of, I mean, the way it works, it's a bicameral legislature, okay? That's what the Episcopal Church has. You could think of it on analogy to the legislative branch of the federal government. The thing is that, the Episcopal Church does not have the equivalent of the executive and the judicial branches of the federal government, but it does have the legislative branch. So you have 2 houses, 2 legislative houses. One is called the House of Deputies. The other is called the House of Bishops. The House of Bishops, pretty self-explanatory, all the bishops. The House of Deputies is comprised of clergy, non-Episcopal clergy, meaning priests and deacons, not bishops, and lay people. Okay, and each diocese has representation in the House of Deputies, and the House of Deputies and the House of Bishops meets for what's called the General Convention of the Episcopal Church once every triennium, once every 3 years. So every 3 years, we get together and people pass all kinds of legislation and there are all kinds of reports and so on. This doesn't mean that the church is like asleep for the rest of the time. It's not. There are standing commissions which comprise General Convention. They have mandates from General Convention and so on. And these standing commissions are, you can be elected to these positions. You do not need to actually be a member of General Convention. That is, you don't need to be a member of the House of Bishops or the House of Deputies to actually be nominated and appointed to one of these standing commissions. There's a kind of all-call after every General Convention for everybody to kind of send in their applications and see what happens. These appointments last any number of years. It varies depending on whether or not you are occupying a seat that's been vacated by somebody and just completing their term, or whether or not you're going to fulfill a whole term. But in any case, these standing commissions work for 3 years and do what the last General Convention has told them to do. And then General Convention gets together, reads all the stuff they've done for the past 3 years, and votes on it, one way or the other. And this is basically what's happened with prayer book revision. So, 3 years ago, General Convention asked the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music, or what I'm going to call the SCLM. We're going to learn all these acronyms really well, because I want for us to read some of the stuff that the SCLM is producing. Some of it's very, very interesting. For example, did you know we have a brand new calendar of saints? Yeah, Liz does. Yeah, really cool, right? And I'm actually very blessed to know the person on the SCLM who did most of, or much of the work actually to revise the church's calendar. So we're going to have Lesser Feasts and Fasts 2018, which is very good news because the last one we had was in 2006. And we can take a look actually at what's changed about the 2018 one versus 2006. It'll be very interesting for us to do so. The really good news on that front is lots more women, okay? Lots more women in 2018 than in 2006. I don't have the statistics right in front of me. They're not off the top of my head, but 2006 was like, it was embarrassing how many more men there were on the calendar than women. And it's not exactly like we have a paucity of female saints or people that we would want to celebrate in the church's calendar who are women in the church. I mean, come on. Look at the composition of this room. One guy, everyone else is female. Anyway, so that was a major problem. That's one of the nice things that is going to come out of General Convention. And there's actually lots of stuff like this. Lots of stuff that the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music has been doing a beautiful job at. And it would be fun to take a look at that. We also, we're going to have a new Book of Occasional Services, which I'll talk about the relationship between the Book of Occasional Services and the Book of Common Prayer a little later on when we're thinking about when we go through the kind of library of liturgical resources that the Episcopal Church has. Everybody thinks it begins and ends with the prayer book. That's actually not true. It's a whole library of stuff, of resources that parishes have actually to create forms of worship with. One of those is the Book of Occasional Services, and we're going to have a new one, which includes some really awesome stuff, like a liturgy for Dia de los Muertos. Really cool. Didn't have that in the old Book of Occasional Services. Now we do. Awesome stuff. So we'll take a look at some of that later on too. But one of the things that the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music was asked to do, and the thing which got the most press, both within the church and outside of it, was they were asked to revise the prayer book, or to come up with a plan for prayer book revision. So they came up with 4 options, and the SCLM wrote an incredibly learned and thoughtful and careful report about this. I mean, it's hundreds of pages. It takes a very long time to go through. If you're interested in it, I'm happy to send it to you. But you don't need to read it. All I'm saying is that the people who are working on your behalf to create beautiful worship are doing it incredibly thoughtfully and are giving a lot of time and effort to it. And they did I personally think they did a very fine job laying out what was not an easy or an obvious plan for the church, especially because the SCLM knew that people in the pews, especially, were incredibly divided about whether or not we wanted a new book. So they came up at one point with 4 plans. What they presented to General Convention actually for them to vote on were 2 plans. One which was they're both targeted towards revision, okay? I mean, the moment that a prayer book comes out, it's headed towards revision, okay? We're always revising the book, and we're always headed, in some sense, towards a new prayer book. It's just a question of when that happens. So the first was, with that caveat, with that disclaimer, it was basically no revision right now. It was, we need to live into the vision of the 1979 prayer book, because the thought was, we're not actually living up to what the 1979 prayer book has asked us to do. And once we actually have a chance to get into the prayer book, I hope that we'll all see that, not even St. Mark's is doing all the stuff that the prayer book asks us to do. And I don't just mean following the rules or the rubrics. I mean, there's a kind of theological vision to the 1979 prayer book, which both lent it its compelling character and also made it incredibly controversial at the time. It's difficult to overestimate just how controversial the 79 revision was. Not just because Episcopalians don't like change. That's part of it. And I'm one of those Episcopalians really who doesn't like very much change. So don't worry. I'm not trying to make fun of anybody. I'm that person. Not just because of that, but because the book was such a radical departure from previous prayer books. And they're interesting. They're going to be interesting theological conversations for us to have, particularly around what is baptism, what is confirmation, what is the priesthood, what are the laity. There's lots of stuff actually about the prayer book that congregations have kind of lived into, but not totally. So it'll be interesting to look at some of those things. There are some other things. Did you know that the architects of the 1979 prayer book intended for every parish, basically, to write their own prayers of the people from scratch? Now, we all use forms, right? We use Form 1, Form 2, Form 3, Form 4, Form 5, Form 6, whatever. And St. Mark's has begun to customize those forms by inserting petitions which have something to do with either the life of our world or what's going on in our parish at the particular moment. That's an effort on our part to live into a little bit, to tiptoe into the water that the 79 book is actually asking us to tiptoe into. But actually the 79 book's not asking you to tiptoe into it, it's asking you to dive into it. The people who revised the prayer book in the 79 book were, they thought that we would basically use these forms for a little while, then we would get over them, and everybody would write their own. And that's actually what the book tells you to do. Nobody does it, right? I mean, how many Episcopal churches have you gone into, and you go to their regular, their version of a 10 o'clock service, their rite to big Eucharist with music and stuff. Has anybody ever been to an Episcopal church where they didn't use one of the standard forms from the prayer book for the prayers of the people? You have? At 10 o'clock? At like a big service? Yeah. And what was that like? What did they do? Yeah. Is Carol the only one? Do you want to speak up?
Are you including Anglicans in the...
I'm only talking about the Americans. Yeah, only talking about the Americans.
My experience was in a church within the Diocese of New York.
Yeah.
That is only open in certain seasons. However, it follows the Book of Common Prayer in every service.
Yeah.
But it has to serve a multi-background
Yeah.
parish that are there. You would say things for holiday, but for some people they spend 6 months there.
Right.
So it is their church, and we follow everything else. And because of the climate of the place,
Mhm.
it was more or less like it's not a retirement place because it's family,
Yeah.
but it included in all the prayers for the people
Yeah.
certain needs of that group of people, which is small, but it included the people who were ill,
Yeah.
the people who were dying, the people who would return,
Yeah.
the place, the elements that were affecting them very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, but again, it is a plain church. It is a church.
Oh, sure.
within the Diocese of Albany. And
Yeah.
yes, we did it every Sunday,
Yeah.
but it was always with an Episcopal priest.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. What you're describing is actually what the writers of the prayer book wanted for everyone to do.
Sounds like the Wednesday service.
It sounds, yes, exactly. It's like the Wednesday service. So if you turn in the book, this is just the proof's in the pudding. So you can always look to the book. If you go to the prayers of the people, which if you got one of these old ones like me, you'll just turn to it. Page 383. You see at the top, prayer is offered with intercession for the universal church, its members and its mission, the nation and all in authority, the welfare of the world, the concerns of the local community, those who suffer and those in any trouble, the departed, with commemoration of a saint when appropriate. Those are the things we're all supposed to pray for. Then it says, any of the forms which follow may be used. Adaptations or insertions suitable to the occasion may be made. Any of the forms may be conformed to the language of the rite being used. A bar in the margin indicates petitions which may be omitted, and so on. That line, adaptations and insertions suitable to the occasion may be made, is meant to be taken quite liberally. Okay? It's like you can take these forms and basically totally rewrite them. These are like
a kind of template for parishes to go in and really customize them so that you pray for all these things which they say you need to pray for in the prayers of the people, but you customize it for your place and your time and your individual congregation. Really, really cool. And so one of these plans was to have more conversations like the short one we just had, and to talk about, well, what is the book asking us to do, and how can we live more fully into it? And also, how can we more fully live into the theology of the prayer book, which we'll just have to get to at another time. We'll get to it in a couple of weeks. Liz?
I have two comments. One is that the 5 o'clock service here
Mm-hmm.
is a certain degree of that kind of prayer.
That's right.
So, for example, when it comes to praying for people who are sick or ill,
Yep.
you read the prayer list, the official prayer list, but then there is silence, so that anyone who is gathered around the altar can ask for their intercession.
That's right.
And there are some services where a lot of people speak up,
Mm-hmm.
and some services where maybe only one person speaks up.
Yep.
But it's very beautiful. And my second comment is that where I have seen extemporaneous prayer as part of the prayers of the people
Mm-hmm.
is in Roman Catholic worshiping community over in Reading
Yeah.
that I attended for 5 years. And it was led by the priest who
Mhm.
would begin, and then it was open up to the congregation. So spontaneously people would ask their prayers for the participant, and then at the very end of it, the entire congregation would say, what was the phrase? Lord have mercy.
Mm-hmm.
Hear our prayer.
Yep.
And I can't tell you how moving
Yeah.
that was.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm totally with you. And you're very right about the 5 o'clock service. And the as far as I can tell, and in the second half of the semester, I want for us to become a part of this conversation by reading some of the journal articles which were written by the people who revised this book, the arguments that they had with one another and so on. But it's so I'm painting with a rather broad brush here by saying the architects of the 79 book intended blah, blah, blah. And, we'll have to test out these statements and see how accurate they are by actually reading some of them, which we will do. But as far as I can tell, the architects of the 79 book wanted for something like what happens at 5 o'clock and something like what happens in that Catholic worshiping community in Reading you were a part of to happen at the main Sunday service. So our version of 10 o'clock. Anyway, this is just an example of one of the many ways that we're not quite doing everything the book might have envisioned we might do. And so that was the first plan, was to basically live into the 79 book a little more and then see what happens. That was the first plan. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, I think it's wonderful to do that, but I have to say at the Congregational Church,
Yeah.
Skip started this thing where he'd say, we pray, and then someone would say, it got so it was 20 minutes
Yep.
of the service.
Yep.
And so, because someone would start, at first no one would say anything, and then someone would start.
Yep.
And then someone would feel like, well, I better say something. And then,
Yep.
so after it got to be 20 minutes, they
Yep.
had to have people turn in little cards
Yep.
asking for people to be prayed for, because, it's actually an interesting question, because
Yep.
how do you,
Yep. And Episcopalians start looking at their watches at 5 till 11. Okay? I'm not going to say anything more because of being recorded. Just to say, time is a sensitive thing. Time is a sensitive thing. It does. Well, yeah. So there are reasons why we're maybe not living into every single part of the 79 prayer book, right? There's some communal exigencies, some practical questions about well, that might have been a nice academic conversation for them to have in the 70s, but that's not just not the way it works. Anyway, but that's actually not a new problem. Anglicans have been praying with prayer books that did not exactly share their theology, or they've been doing some things they were asked to do, but not all the things they were asked to do, or they were doing some of the things that they've been asked to do, but meaning different things by them than what the people who actually wrote the prayers meant by them themselves for a very long time. Because one of the things I would like to talk about when we talk about the history of the prayer book is how basically the only person who really agreed with Thomas Cranmer about everything was Thomas Cranmer. And we've been praying with Thomas Cranmer's prayers ever since then. And most of us, nearly all of us, don't mean by them what Cranmer himself meant when he wrote them. Okay, so this is not a new problem. And that's just another part of, well, common prayer. Just how common is common? What's common about the prayer, actually? It'll be an interesting spiritual conversation for us to have. Yes, thank you. Thank you for that, Cindy. There are reasons why we don't do this at 10 o'clock. And it's not all about the fact that, everybody starts checking their watches at 5 till 11, but that is a part of it. And we do, to be honest with you, the clergy and the liturgical staff do pay a great deal of attention to how long the prayers are, and to how long each segment of the Mass is, because, and we'll speak about this a little bit, you don't want liturgy, you want it neither to be hasty nor ponderous. Because if you do either of those things, you get distracted by the liturgy. And one of the things about liturgy that I want for us to think about in the course of the semester, I know I'm giving you lots of these themes, okay, but this is what the intro day is about. One of the things I would like for us to think about is the kind of transparency that a liturgy is trying to achieve between God and humans. The nice thing about being in a liturgical tradition, and you can be a part of a tradition, there are beautiful traditions which are not liturgical, but kind of the point of being in a liturgical tradition is that you learn the rhythm of the liturgy, and then the liturgy gets out of the way, and it's just you and God at that point. That's the nice thing about the liturgy. That's the nice thing about being a part of a liturgical tradition. Now, there are downsides to it. Namely, there have been plenty of critiques about people who come in and say their prayers, they're rote, they're memorized, they don't actually mean them, they don't actually feel anything, and then they go out the door. The positive upshot, the positive spin on that, the spin that somebody like me, so I'm an Episcopal prayer, I'm kind of into this, the positive spin you could give to it is that you learn the liturgy, and then the liturgy gets out of the way. And one of the things that you have to always be mindful of is anything that poses a distraction to prayer. And if a segment of the Mass takes too long, it becomes a distraction. You start going, oh man, are we still here? Like,
Is one more person going to open their mouth, I'll kill them.
yeah, right. Indeed. You can say this about the Congregationalists. I'm not going to say it about the Congregationalists, but yes. Okay. There are lots of other things that went into the 79 prayer book, one of which was a huge ecumenical consensus around the way that early church Christians worshipped. In particular, there's a book called The Apostolic Tradition of Hippolytus, which we will take a look at, that provided a certain order for the Eucharistic service that basically all of the liturgical churches, so meaning the liturgical Protestant churches and the Roman Catholic Church, kind of thought, oh yeah, that was the way that early Christians must have worshipped. Let's worship in that way. And so we're going to actually put side by side the apostolic tradition and the forms for the Eucharist in our prayer book and see, wow, yeah, so this the kind of the correspondence. Here's the thing. Scholars think that people in the 70s wildly overestimated how early the apostolic tradition actually was. So, did ancient Christians worship in this way? Yeah, but ancient's pretty broad. They were not nearly as early as, the apostolic tradition is not nearly as early as we thought it was. So anyway, there's some conversations like that about the 79 book and living into it. It's like, well, maybe there's pieces of the 79 book that are just eccentric. There's some things about it that might be wrong. Maybe they're not practical. Maybe there's some things like this ecumenical consensus around the apostolic tradition that have been proved to be historically inaccurate. Maybe there's something in the book, maybe there's a lot of stuff in the book that needs changed. Much of the conversation about the book being revised has focused on the question of inclusive or expansive language with regard to gender. And we'll talk about that towards the end of the class when we think a little bit about how theological language works and how the language of prayer works. But there are all of these other kind of questions about, about the theology of the book, but also it's whether or not it got some of the historical questions wrong. Is the book, some of the book's stuff not practical? And B, was some of it just incorrect?
that's also underneath the motivations for quicker revision. And that's what led to the second proposal. And the second proposal was a plan to revise the book basically in something like 9 years. So still a long time. Here's what happened. So General Convention got together and the House of Deputies passed that second version. Okay, they passed the kind of 9-year revision process. I should also, it got to the House of Bishops, and the House of Bishops said, "No way." They put the kibosh on it, and what they did instead was they passed a resolution that, as far as I can tell, says everything that anybody ever wanted to say about prayer book revision. It basically says yes and no, and it allowed every bishop to be able to come back to their diocese and to say that they voted in the way that the diocese would want them to vote by voting yes, regardless of whether their diocese was pro or against revision. So what was actually passed was it's been called it's been called the Doyle Amendment. It's because the bishop who was the primary author of this legislation was Bishop Andy Doyle, who's the bishop of the Diocese of Texas. And Bishop Doyle's amendment, basically, it wasn't much of, it was technically an amendment, like legislatively, but it basically just deleted all the text of the original resolution that was passed by the House of Deputies, and it replaced all of it. It rewrote the entire thing. And what it did was it formed an additional committee. Formed an additional committee called the Task Force on Prayer Book Revision and Liturgical something or other. All I know is that I can't exactly, it's a crazy long acronym. What we're all calling it is TIFLPIBR. It's the way to actually say the acronym. And anyway, so it founded this thing called TIFLPIBR. And TIFLPIBR's job, is this huge task force. It's composed of like equal parts laity, bishops, priests, and deacons. And it's supposed to, they were given a charge to ensure that the committee reflects the gender, racial, theological diversity of the Episcopal Church. So it's this massive committee. What they're tasked with doing is basically collecting resources from diocesan TIFLPIBRs. So every diocese is supposed to have a liturgical-like committee thing to be testing out new rites, testing out new liturgies, and then receiving those through the diocese and then up into TIFLPIBR, and TIFLPIBR is going to take a look at all this stuff, and then eventually maybe they'll start to revise the book. I don't know. Everybody's sentence kind of trails off into the I don't know. Okay, so it set up this committee. At the same time, it memorialized the 1979 Book of Common Prayer. Nobody knows what it means to memorialize something, but that's what it says. Okay, some people think that means they will never have to use another prayer book in their life ever again. Some people think it means the 1979 prayer book is dead today. Okay, because you memorialize it, and you're either celebrating the funeral or you're saying it's like the end-all, be-all of all Episcopal liturgy ever, okay? So this is the genius of this piece of legislation, right? Everyone could vote for it, and it mean exactly what they wanted it to mean, okay? Which is how it ended up passing. Basically, where we are is this. Our church is continuing to have a conversation about the prayer book, about its worship and liturgy. It doesn't seem to, one of the practical sides of it is that the prayer book revision has basically been taken out of the hands of the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music and put into the hands of this TIFLPIBR thing. The SCLM is now working on different sorts of projects. They're going to finish the calendar revision. They're going to continue working on the Book of Occasional Services. They're also going to translate, they're going to be translating, I don't know if this is SCLM or somebody else, but I think it's SCLM. They're going to be translating the Book of Common Prayer into other languages, particularly into French Creole and into Spanish. Now, we do currently have translations, but they're not good. Okay, this is a major conversation that happened at General Convention this last year. The translations we currently have are word for word, and they're incredibly clunky for native speakers of Spanish and French Creole, and
they're so clunky and they're so poorly written in their in the vernacular of those languages that they become impediments to worship. I mean, what you want to talk about, like distractions to the liturgy disappearing, that's one of them. So instead, they're going to use a method called dynamic equivalence, which is where you try and communicate the meaning of the sentence in another language, but you're not doing a word-for-word translation. That takes much more time. It also takes a great deal of money, but we have to do it. It's a real shame, and I think it's an injustice, actually, that our Spanish and French-speaking congregations in the Episcopal Church have had such a poor translation of the prayer book to pray with for so long. So this is far overdue. But anyway, so the SCLM is going to be doing this other stuff, and then Tifel-Pibber is going to take over prayer book revision, which basically means we have kicked the can way down the road so that we're not going to have prayer book revision for a very long time. I don't know when. It'll be sometime. Who knows when? Probably in our lifetimes. Maybe not. Nobody really knows. So that's kind of where we are. But it does mean we are having conversations about this stuff. It's one reason why I wanted to have a conversation with you about it, because I'm very interested in what people who are actual parishioners in the actual pews think about some of these questions. Much of the conversation around revision has happened in academic circles and in like professional church circles, okay? People who are professional church people who go to General Convention and so on. And there was a major feeling, particularly on social media during General Convention, that these decisions were being made on our behalf, but they hadn't actually listened to what people in the pews wanted to say. So I want to talk with you about some of these issues. We're going to look at the 79 book. We're going to learn how to use it. We're going to ask some questions about how it can be a more central part of our spiritual lives, individually, potentially as a parish. And we're also going to look at the theology of the book, the process of its revision, and so on, and then ask some of these questions so that we can begin to participate in the conversation the wider church is having, because if we don't do it, they'll have the conversation without us, okay? And my end goal after this class is I would like to write an editorial talking about the experience of having taught this class. And I'll be talking to you guys more about that as our conversations go on. So I know we got 5 minutes. Questions about what I've said, thoughts, and then I'll give a brief word about the books we're going to use and what the plan is for next week. Molly and then Liz.
Do you know anything about what they're doing about music?
So hymnal revision is in the air, but hymnals have historically not been revised until prayer books have been revised. So you see, when we got a new prayer book, 1979, of course, we're still calling it the new prayer book. It was 1979. Anyway, we got the 1982 hymnal after the prayer book. It's been our custom, basically, to revise the prayer book first and then revise the hymnal. People are talking about it, but most of the energy is around the prayer book because it's just kind of, you got to get your ducks in a row first.
What about the music you use in the choir? It has to be text. Do they have any other music, or what are they looking at? Do you know?
Sure. So the National Church is not, the National Church and the prayer book doesn't actually seem to give a whole lot of direction on what the music needs to be. So the way that our canons work is that the rector of every parish is responsible for the liturgy that takes place, for the worship of the parish, which means that the rector has jurisdiction over the music too. So that it's really a local question. If you wanted an Episcopal church that sang popular music with non-sacred texts, I don't actually think that there's a canonical or a rubric impediment to that. It's just the rector would have to agree to it. Yeah. But there are conversations about the theology of the liturgy that are quite interesting, and about the questions of that sort. But there's nothing like, people aren't talking about which anthems we want to sing in like 2083 or something.
I did have a question without interrupting.
Sure.
I did, about a piece we were going to do and we didn't do.
Mm.
And I said, is this sacred text?
Sure. Yeah.
But you can interpret it as sacred.
Yeah, sure.
So the rector didn't do it, I think he wanted to think about it a bit more.
Yeah, sure.
Consult with others.
Sure.
I don't know, but it does come up.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. Liz.
At the end of the 10 years,
Mm-hmm.
brainstorming and discussing and debating.
Yeah.
Is there any expectation that there will be some grant language coming out?
Yeah. Nobody knows. So here's the thing. We now don't have a 10-year process. We have a who knows how long process. Okay? So the legislation says there's going to be this committee. It's the beginning. We're going to start revision. We don't know how long it's going to last. And here's the practical thing. Tiffelpibber, I know, it's just so much fun. Tiffelpibber was given an incredibly low budget. And my understanding of I would have to go back and read it, but my understanding of the resolution is that the resolution actually leaves it up basically to the budgetary people to find the money somewhere in the budget. So it gives them, like, I forget if it's $100,000 or $300,000, or maybe it's even less than $100,000. I can't remember off the top of my head. It's basically enough money to get all, I mean, because the committee's so big, it's basically enough money to send all these people somewhere to meet in person one time in 3 years. Now, you can't do anything with that, right? So it's basically an unfunded mandate. And, you know, legislatures love to do this. They do it on they do it on a federal level. We do it in the church. You say, I'm going to do X, Y, or Z, and then you just don't fund it adequately. And that's what some commentators have been saying was some of the impetus behind the resolution. I don't know if that was an intentional thing. What I do know is that there was a lot of sticker shock in the church around how much prayer book revision was going to cost. SCLM in both the plans, let's live into the 79 prayer book for 9 years, and let's or however long it was, it's about 9 years, and let's revise the prayer book in about 9 years. Those budgets were $2 million plus, okay, for just 3 years, for just this next triennium. It's very, very expensive to do this. Now there was a lot of negative feeling about how expensive it was. Why are we putting millions of dollars into writing a book that we already have a book? The book is pretty good. Even people who don't like the book are like, ish, it's fine, ish. Some people, there are some people who really hate the book. Some people really hate the book. I don't want to go into that because I'm being recorded. Some people really hate it. But most people are like, meh, or they're like, yes, it's my thing. And people are like, why do we need to spend $2 million on this when we could be spending $2 million on evangelism, or on, we could give $2 million to Episcopal Relief and Development or something. That's one side of it. The other side is, we have a prayer book right now that is a marvelous piece of literature and theology. The theology of this book is incredibly deep, and most people don't appreciate it because we just don't spend a lot of time with it outside the Eucharistic liturgy, and it is incredibly interesting. And so, W.H. Auden was involved in the writing of our Psalter. Does everybody know that? W.H. Auden was on the committee to revise the Psalter. And he was very famously against revision. He did not want to revise the 79 book. And there's a delicious letter of his written about this. And I'll show it to you, about why we ought to keep the 1928 book and not move to 79. But W.H. Auden was on the committee to revise the Psalter, and he was involved with that doesn't happen every day. So if we're going to revise the book, and see, for Episcopalians, clergy, a lot of clergy break this rule. I don't. But a lot of clergy break this rule. But technically, we are bound by ordination vows and by our canons not to facilitate or to lead worship using any form which is not authorized by the church. That means that book.
So where does that leave New Zealand?
You can't use it.
Really?
We're not supposed to use it. Now, a lot of dioceses do allow it. Or there are ways to use prayers from other prayer books within the rubrics of the 1979 book, which I'm going to show you. There's basically a build your own Eucharistic liturgy that nobody knows is in there. Like, you can basically make it all up from scratch. Nobody knows it's there. We call it Form 3 in seminary. You can basically say whatever you want to. So Form 3 is what 5 o'clock is here. Nobody knows it, but that's what it is. So you could basically do the whole New Zealand liturgy using that, but you would technically be using the 79 prayer book. But that's an incredibly controversial thing, and our diocese actually had a resolution to the last General Convention to authorize other prayer books that are currently being used elsewhere in the Anglican Communion, because there are lots of cool prayer books being used, and these are in our traditions. Why can't we use them? Exactly. A lot of bishops make exceptions. The question is whether or not the bishop actually has the authority to make the exception. Some bishops think that they don't, and so they just don't say anything, and they let their priests get away with it if they want to do it, but they just don't say anything. Some bishops say they do have the authority, and so they make exceptions, or they don't. But it is a kind of ambiguous question that's not been decided at a national church level. But so Episcopalians, I mean, you know, you guys can go do whatever you want. There are not a whole lot of rules for laity. There's some reasons why I think you should use the prayer book, because it's beautiful, and I'm going to try and give it the hard sell, but you're not forced to. Clergy are forced to use it. Ooh, my mic, sorry. Clergy are forced to use it. And if we write a new prayer book, whatever the new one is probably the only other one I will ever use in my entire life. So I really care about how good it is, right? And I think we all ought to care. So $2 million sounds like an awful lot of money. But this is what the church does day in and day out. And it might, I mean, heaven forbid, it take us some time and some resources actually to do it right. And the question is whether or not the church has the will to do it right in the current moment. I think that the overall message of the resolution that was passed is that we don't. We're headed towards it. We're in a conversation. But who knows where it's going to go. A couple things about the books for this class, because I know I got to let you go. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at this book by Derek Olson. It's called Inwardly Digest. Yeah, I'm going to post a PDF of the reading for next week on Realm, just because it might take you guys a little while to get your books. The reading for next week is just going to be the foreword and the first part of the first chapter. So it's pages 3 through 29. And I'll make you a PDF and I'll put it on Realm on our site. The author is Derek Olson, D-E-R-E-K, and you spell Olson O-L-S-E-N. Dr. Olson is a former chair of the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music. He's not the current chair, but he's a former chair. He's an incredibly bright and brilliant scholar, and he's a lay person, and he really, really cares about the church and about its liturgy. And he's written what I think is a really beautiful book, not just on the prayer book, like the nuts and bolts of it, but the prayer book as a guide to spiritual life, to your spiritual life. So this is where we're going to be talking about what's in the book, what does it mean to worship, and what does it mean to be a people who worship using a book. Pages 3 through 29. 3 through 29. There are a couple other books on the prayer book which are good that I'll use from time to time. I'll give you PDFs of these. You don't need to buy it. One is by the current Bishop of Chicago, Jeffrey Lee, who is currently on the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music and is very involved in conversations about prayer book revision. This is a book that he wrote as part of the New Church's teaching series, which has books on everything from like the Bible to the liturgy to the end of time. Anyway, it's really quite good. This is his book on the prayer book, and I'll use it from time to time, but I'll give you those readings. This book, I'm not going to ask you. I mean, it looks like it would be. It's $33. It's not as expensive as it looks. It's not like $100 or something. But this is the commentary on the American Prayer Book, and I'll give you excerpts from this too. One of the things that this is written by Marion J. Hatchett. You'll get familiar with Hatchett's name as we go forward. Hatchett was one of the quote-unquote architects of the prayer book. He was one of the liturgical theologians teaching in our seminaries who kind of was he's one of the brains behind the book. There are a whole cast of characters we'll get acquainted with. Hatchett wrote this book, and it basically walks you through all the prayers in the book and all the liturgies and says why they said what they said, where it came from, and what they wanted for us to do about it. Really, really cool, actually. Had we had more time, I was going to discuss the Collect for Purity, which is, I'll start there next week. I want to talk about the Collect for Purity because it is, the Collect for Purity, you know, we say it every single week at the beginning of the Eucharist. That was an innovation that Thomas Cranmer introduced when he drafted the first prayer books. It's an ancient text that was actually formerly written for the priest to say as part of their pre-mass preparatory prayers, their private prayers said by the priest in the sacristy as they were getting
vested in preparing for worship and so on. Cranmer wanted for everybody to say the prayer, so he put it in the public rite. Really interesting. And I want to talk about the theology of it because I want to talk about what does it mean actually to worship and to pray. We think we pray all the time. It's Eleanor a long time ago told me that prayer is a heart-to-heart with God, and indeed it really is. How is it that we have a heart-to-heart with God? How does that work? And the Collect for Purity actually has quite a lot to say about that and about the intervention of the Holy Spirit. Had we had more time, we were going to look at that and then look at the 8th chapter of Romans, but alas, we don't. So we'll do that next week. There are, as Amanda just brought up, there are tons of other prayer books in the Anglican Communion. These are just a couple that you're welcome to take a look at here after class. This is the New Zealand prayer book, incredibly popular in Episcopal circles. It's often used, it's incredibly commonly used at Episcopal camps and youth events. Particularly, there's a beautiful liturgy for Compline, or night prayer, as it's called in the New Zealand prayer book. It's really beautiful. So here's a copy of that. I wish that Marcy was here, because this is her prayer book. This is the prayer book of the Anglican Church of South Africa. This, of course, is the 1928 prayer book, much of which is preserved in Rite 1. There were very interesting conversations around General Convention about writing into resolutions for revision that Rite 1 wouldn't be touched, that kind of thing. Anyway, interesting conversations around that. But we will have to talk about the fact that we still have a Rite 1, because that was a huge controversy in 1979. 1928 prayer book, we'll take a look at that. There are lots of changes between that and this. One of which is the lectionary. Most of the 1928 prayer book, those of you who grew up with it will remember, is taken up by the calendar of readings. And they could do this. They could print all the readings for every week in the prayer book because they only had one cycle of readings. Now we have a 3-year cycle. It covers a great deal more of Scripture. Anyway, but an interesting conversation that was had in 28. And this is volume 1 of 35, 37, 38, 39. I don't know how many volumes are in Common Worship now. This is the prayer book of the Church of England. Technically, the Church of England still uses the Book of Common Prayer 1662, because unlike the Episcopal Church, they have to get Parliament to approve a new prayer book. So they finally gave up, and they said, we will technically still use 1662 as our prayer book, but we're just going to publish other books. And so what the Church of England has now is a library of liturgical resources. This is volume 1 of 30, 40, something like that. And there's a lot of conversation in our church now about whether or not we want to move to this model. Whether or not we want the 1979 book to be kind of like what 1662 is for the Church of England, and then publish a whole bunch of these things. Now in practice in England, everybody uses this, and nobody uses 1662. So that model is often held up by people who are big fans of the 79 prayer book and don't want it to change. But in practice, in the Church of England, everybody uses the new stuff. Nobody uses the old stuff. But anyway, interesting stuff. If you want to take a look at these, you can. Jude, one last word. Yeah. Oh, cool. Yeah. Absolutely. And the more non-American prayer books you look at, the more you realize just how unique the American 1979 book is. It really is quite unique. Oh man, I can't wait to talk to you guys about what makes it unique. In any case, I have to let you go. If you want to check out some of these books, you can. I'll see you next week. God bless you.